I wanted to start with a confession. It's a fairly simple confession, and that is I have been driving for a very long time. I drove for the first time, as many Americans do, when I was 16, and I have been driving a lot since then. I would say I get behind the wheel almost every day, and gosh, maybe have done hundreds of thousands of miles over the years. But here's the confession. I still struggle with driving. I still get nervous when I come into turns, when it snows outside. I'm still not 100% sure how to navigate the streets. And I'm no longer a teenager. You can see that, of course, but I still struggle with parallel parking. How is this possible? How is it really possible that one can spend so much time doing something and not get any better at it? And this idea, I think, is really core to learning to learn how to get better and faster at learning in this time when learning is so important. When I reflect on my driving and why I haven't gotten better, I'll just say that it isn't a matter of, practice. It isn't a matter of caring. In fact, if you look at my handwriting, which I've also been doing for years, it has not even actually stayed the same. It's gotten, in fact, worse. So how is this possible? And the research suggests that the reason that I am not a good driver is that I have not embraced these very simple steps that we can use to become better at learning. I'm going to talk and walk you through some of those techniques during this talk very briefly. One is just the value of making meaning. This is similar to this idea of learning by doing. How we can use our cognitive power really to get better at learning. Also going to talk a little bit about the importance of metacognition, thinking about your thinking. And then third, want to really discuss with you and underscore the importance of forgetting. We all forget, and we forget at a regular rate, and we can take advantage of that fact to become better at learning. Before I go into these details, I did want to talk a little bit about some of the myths of learning because they're pervasive. I often hear from people that some people are right-brained or left-brained, that some people are visual learners. In other words, they learn better with their eyes, or audio learners. There's not a lot of evidence for these theories. For instance, the idea that some people are visual learners, no evidence for that. I often see people using highlighters, again, no evidence for that. Instead, what really matters about learning is, are we cognitively engaged? Are we getting the feedback that we need? Are we really engaging this material in a way that creates expertise? So let's talk about this first lesson, this idea of making meaning. I'm going to start with a quick example. Not a long time ago, I went to visit a cognitive science expert named Bennett Schwartz in Florida. And when I walked into his office, we chatted a bit, and he asked me a question, which is, what is the capital of Australia? And if you would have asked me before I visited Bennett Schwartz, I would have told you. I'm pretty confident that I would know the capital of Australia. And he went and he asked me, was it Sydney? He asked me what the capital was. I first said Sydney. I ran down a number of other potential cities, Melbourne and so forth. And then when he told me the actual answer, that it was Canberra, I was just shocked. I had no idea. And what researchers call this is is a big issue, right? It's that reflection moment where you're like, aha, you thought you knew something and you did not. And this is just a really simple way of making learning more effective. It's called the hypercorrection effect. When you believe that you knew something and then you're corrected, it is a far more effective way of learning. And we can use this to learn ourselves. We can engage in this hypercorrection effect in all sorts of ways. One thing that I highly recommend is to make sure that you're quizzing yourself. It's not as similar as to having a mistake, but quizzing yourself forces you to make mistakes. It forces you and pushes you in order to make yourself a better learner. Another thing that you can do is even just talk to yourself while you're learning. That slows down your learning and allows you to engage in more effective ways. And these forms of learning, this form of mental doing, is going to be far more effective. So if, for instance, tomorrow your boss asks you to read a memo and present on it in the morning, instead of reading the memo or even rereading the memo, read it once and then begin to put the document away and engage in retrieval practice, engage in making meaning, put the document away and simply start to talk about it yourself as if you'd be explaining it to your partner or a colleague. Do a brain dump, another very effective way. And these are just some very simple techniques, some very simple tips that you can use to make yourself really engage in this very core idea, making meaning, making sure that you're really engaged in this learning by doing. The other issue that I really want to flag here in this second tool, the second takeaway, is the importance of metacognition, of what researchers talk about as thinking about your thinking. I want to give a simple example of metacognition, and I call it this humming game. And if we can, participate in this humming game, if you wouldn't mind just sort of taking a moment and thinking about your favorite song. So if you love, Frank Sinatra, think about your favorite Frank Sinatra song, and then hum it. Don't use the word, but just sort of hum it to yourself. So, for instance, for myself, I would go, and then when you hum this song, if you were to hum it to a friend, you clearly hear it in your own mind, right? In the Frank Sinatra song, you hear his deep voice, you might hear the tunes otherwise. But other people, if they were to guess what that song was, it tends to be a very low rate. In other words, other people have a really hard time hearing what you hear in your own mind. And this is very clear in this humming game. The point here is this issue of metacognition, or thinking about thinking. We often believe that we know a lot more than we do. People often believe that they're smarter than the average person. People often believe that they're better looking than the average person. One of my favorites, people often believe that they are harder working than their average colleague. And this overconfidence really impedes learning. It makes us too confident about what we know and what we're able to do. This happens particularly when we are very familiar with a task. One of the reasons that I'm overconfident about my driving is that I myself spend, of course, a lot of time driving. But we can use this metacognition, we can use this thinking about thinking to become a better learner. How does that work? Asking ourselves very specific questions around, do I know this? Am I sure that I know this? Practicing if you could explain this idea to friends, to colleagues. These are all forms of metacognition, monitoring your own learning, that can be really effective. One thing that's a corollary to this idea is this notion of planning, of making sure that you're setting up the time that you need in order to learn. This allows yourself to engage in better cognition, so setting up goals, setting aside time. These are really powerful ways to engage in metacognition and to make sure that you're thinking about your own thinking. The third aspect of learning that I think is incredibly key, especially in this age of AI, is forgetting. Now, people often talk as they grow older that they forget a lot more, but it is really surprising about how much people forget. So, for instance, if you just heard the word metacognition for the first time during this talk, there's about a 50% likelihood that you will have forgotten that word within 24 hours. Now, I'm really excited to be here, thrilled to share with you and Mariam and the team here these ideas about learning. But I have to realize for myself that if you've come across some of these ideas for the first time, it is almost a 50% chance that you will have forgotten some of these ideas by tomorrow. And we can reflect on this point because it's key to learning effectively. For one, we can use this forgetting. We can use this forgetting to help ourselves become better learners. We can also just make sure that we keep in mind that our brain forgets, and it forgets at this really regular rate. The thing that I want to underscore is that researchers now believe that our brain doesn't really actually forget something. It actually just puts that information further and further in our mind. So you can think in many ways of our brain as like an attic, that there is information in there, and it can be memories that are very old from your childhood, and the brain simply makes them less accessible. It pushes them further and further back into the attic. And then there's information that you might need today, like knowing where you parked your car or knowing where you put your cell phone. And your brain keeps that top of mind, and it keeps that easier to access. And this is important, of course, because we don't want to remember where we left our phone 2 weeks ago. We want to remember where we left our phone this morning so we can find it again. So how does the brain distinguish between what it puts in the back of the attic versus the front of the attic? And that is actually pulling from the brain's background. So pulling information from the brain is actually what keeps it more accessible to us. So one way to simply engage and help around for this forgetting curve is to simply pull things more frequently from memory, and specifically allowing yourself to recall something, learn something, allow yourself to forget that, and then call it back up from memory is a really effective way of learning. So how can you use this in your own learning? Well, one thing that really underscores making sure that you spread your learning out over time. All of us, like university students, would cram. And the thing about cramming is that it does help you for the exam the next day. But cramming is particularly unhelpful when it comes to having that learning that is going to be needed. So what can you do to make sure that you don't cram, that you engage in this type of spacing that allows your learning to be really endurable over time? Is taking lots of breaks. So you would be much better if you wanted to practice a speech for a presentation, doing a little bit each day because it allows for your inevitable time for forgetting. Another way to think about this is that if you're practicing something, mix up your practice. It is ineffective to always practice the same thing over and over again. So for instance, if you were practicing the piano and you want to get better at Beethoven and Bach and Mozart, many people would try and practice all their Beethoven in one session and then practice all their Bach in another session. But you'd be much better off mixing up your practice. So play a little Bach, play a little Beethoven, and then mix that learning up. It's far more effective. Why? Again, it allows for this act of forgetting, so allowing us to have more information to leave our brains, or at least leave the forefront of our brains, and then recover it again, because this act of relearning is far more effective. Another way that is really powerful for forgetting is simply sleep. This is both true for naps and taking a good night's sleep, but this is, again, this other form of forgetting that can be really, really powerful. What's interesting here, and this is my final point, though I will elaborate on it a little bit, is that the way our brain works is not going to change. So evolution has produced us in this way over thousands upon thousands of years to learn in a very specific manner, in a very specific way. And we can make our learning faster. We can make our learning more effective by engaging in these techniques. But when people talk about the future of learning, what the future holds is a lot more learning, but the way our brain actually works isn't going to change. One of my favorite examples of this is this idea, and you often hear it in these types of plenary talks, that the information that is on the web, the information that is on your phone, will simply make clear that you don't need to memorize anything anymore. That memorizing rote information isn't important because so much of the information is on the web. And frankly, that's simply not true. We still need to memorize. We still need to engage in knowing basic facts. And my favorite example of this is just asking the question, haben Sie heute Morgen gefrühstückt? Which is German for, have you had breakfast this morning? Now, with Google Translate and other tools, you could look up each of those words really fast. But unless they're at top of mind, unless you really have a keen sense of those words and that you've really memorized them, it's going to be very hard to learn. Another way of thinking about this is that your background knowledge is one of the best predictors of future learning. So the more you know about AI, the more you're able to learn about AI. The more you know about Python, the more you're able to learn Python. The more Spanish you know, the more you're able to learn Spanish. I underscore this because when we talk about learning and development, when we talk about the future of learning, we have to make sure that the human body, the human brain, is built to learn in specific ways. And the most effective learning is going to take advantage of those approaches. At the same time, we can really reflect and know that learning has some ways in which we can bootstrap it. There are some ways that we can get better at learning. And again, one, we can engage in learning by doing these acts of cognitive retrieval practice. So asking yourself questions, making sure that you're not a passive learner, but really engaging in learning in this more active way. Second, engage in thinking about thinking, making sure that you can ask yourself these questions of, do I know what I know? Can I ask myself and explain these ideas to someone else? And then third, making sure that you engage in this thinking about thinking, these issues of forgetting, and making sure that you give yourself that time to remember and then re-remember. One, we can have just Zoom overload. We can spend too much time on our computers, our devices, our phones, and just simply get overwhelmed. What are ways to deal with this? I think one is to recognize that you have a problem and that you're not alone. When we think about the ways in which, and this is particularly true about phones, and the way that they're created is really trying to create this type of anxiety that we're about to get a message, we're about to get something important. And it's very similar, as many have pointed out, to gambling. If you go to a slot machine and you pull the device and, maybe you're going to win, maybe you're not. It's not all that similar than, refreshing on your Gmail to see if you got another message. So recognizing that the technology companies have in many ways built these tools for us to become lost in them. Then what are ways in which you can move beyond this and push back against these types of digital dementias? Lots of course, recommendations out there, but one, doing some digital detoxes. So taking time away from devices. This is particularly important, before bed, before sleep, making sure you have some time away. And then recognizing that these tools can be very overloading. So if you really need to focus on writing an article, doing some coding, making sure that you've turned off all the different ways in which the devices reach you, and you can set out an hour, 2 hours of your day really to get that type of work done. The most important thing to keep in mind when you're learning is that you want to be taught by someone who understands that skill. So when we think about how to learn effectively, we want to engage in a learning process. So for instance, if you think about learning to ride a bike, if you just came upon a bike, never seen anyone ride a bike, it's going to be very hard to acquire that skill and or knowledge on your own. So I want to make sure that I'm answering this question while also giving some background, which is, whether it's skills or knowledge, and no matter the domain, right? So whether or not you're trying to get just sort of an overall basic understanding of machine learning versus actually acquiring the skill of machine learning, the best way to do it is to get experts. And not only that, you want to have experts who can explain that information to you in an effective way. So at the end of the day, there are going to be some differences between domains and skills, but the wider differences are going to be among the types of topics, whether you want to get better at your golf game or if you want to get better at accounting.